I think in a way what I want to try and talk about tonight is actually this whole interface between research, the process of knowledge exchange and the translation of science into practice, and actually the importance of skills, both in terms of the skills for the process of translation, but in particular the skills and the training that's required across the whole of the sort of agri-food industry in order to be able to receive the messages which then allow those, you might say, innovation to take place. And I think it's instructive that the ATPs were born really out of the Food Research Partnership which John Beddington put together, where there were two subgroups set up. One subgroup was focused on skills, and Celia Calcutt from BBSRC chaired that group, and out of that really gave the evidence for BBSRC to put the money in to start what has really clearly been a great success here at Nottingham and with other partners at Harper and Cranfield and Rothamsted. But I just want to put a bit more sort of flesh on it, because I think it's bigger than just simply a grant to do something. I think it's something which we need to live with and advance with. And I think it's really the fact that if we're talking about businesses, then all businesses, any business that doesn't innovate, essentially becomes uncompetitive and goes out of business. So actually, if we're talking about a competitive industry, across the piece from primary production and supply chains, innovation is absolutely essential. And the elements to innovation are these three things. Research, which actually provides often information which is not initially useful, but some of which will be. The process of transferring knowledge in a variety of different directions through the knowledge exchange process. And of course, the skills and training, which, as I said a moment ago, are required. So it's really this sort of triangle that I want to sort of talk about. Now, we are at a period in time which, this would not have happened. This sort of creation of this environment in which we're talking about, this would have not happened, 20, 25 years ago. In fact, it probably wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. But now we are at a point in time where food is absolutely right at the top of the political agenda, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that, and I'm not going to go through the detail of this slide, but you can see really that environmental issues, nutritional issues, a whole area of politics associated with civil unrest when people are living in cities, as they mostly are these days, and are unable to afford food, and all the consequences of that. And so it is a really important area of activity, where previously, if you look at this graph from Foresight, which was another project I was involved with some years ago, it tells us why it was that probably from what that graph would say from the early 80s through until around about 2007, why actually there was so much disinvestment in agriculture and food and the research infrastructure, etc. Because we think we've got volatility in our food markets at the moment. It is nothing compared to where we were in the period before, the early 80s. Now, so every country in the world was investing really seriously in their food systems, through the research, extension activity, and all the rest of it. But basically, once we got into the early 80s, the Green Revolution had run its course. The world was awash with food. Nobody was making any money out of food, although it was actually, as I think I say up there was a lot of commercial innovation, because it was very hard to make money, particularly if you were, say, in the agri-tech area of sort of ag-chem or seeds. A lot of innovation commercially, but governments all over the world, not just in this country, were disinvesting themselves from the skills base. It didn't mean to say they were not spending money. They were spending money on other things, quite a lot of influence, not inappropriately, on environmental interactions and also social aspects, and of course a lot of money going upstream, and the whole of the genomics revolution in a sense was born out of the money that was previously taken away from, you might say, some of the more practical aspects of agriculture. But we've now entered a rather different world, and it is astonishing actually to me at least, and maybe to you as well, that actually the Chancellor, just a few years ago now, I think 2012, actually got up and actually listed agricultural technologies amongst the areas that government was going to invest in order to actually increase the, effectively create the growth in the economy, which was clearly much needed after the recession. And you can see all those other things that the Chancellor said, including agricultural technologies. Subsequently, we actually have government publicity saying that amongst the 8 great technologies which are going to, you might say, fuel our regrowth in Britain, we have agri-science. So that is actually one of the 8 great technologies which government is now committed to investing in. This is astonishing, really, for people. I mean, all of you have been around in times past thinking that this is actually the government of the UK saying that this is where the future is coming from. And of course, I think we owe some gratitude for this thinking from John Beddington, previous Chief Scientific Advisor, who portrayed very graphically this notion of the perfect storm. You'll have all heard about this, but I think what's worth reflecting on now is that I think when we produced the Foresight report 3 years ago, we were quite optimistic about the trajectory for population and also quite optimistic about issues related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. I think actually in 3 years that optimism is unfounded. We've now seen data coming out of a big study from the United Nations just published in Science, which demonstrates really that by the time we get to 2050, the curve of population will not have turned over, and it will probably, the population will continue to increase through the end of this century, and we will probably be on a trajectory of about 11 billion rather than 9 billion. So that's a less optimistic figure. And certainly it looks like next year we are going to hit the 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, if not next year, the year after. So actually that trajectory is also wrong. So I think actually the perfect storm is still a real issue, and it's something that we need to take account of. One of the things which got less publicity than the Foresight report was the National Ecosystem Assessment, which was also internationally quite significant, although it was very much a UK document. It was a huge work. I mean, the published document is about that deep. But it actually was an important statement about ecosystem services, of which food production is, of course, an ecosystem service. And it actually analysed significantly where we've come from, where things are going in a good direction and where things are going in a bad direction. And it's relevant, something I shall say in a while, about really the way we think about land use, the way in which we think about the way we manage land, because this is very relevant, I think, to some of the other issues which I sort of alluded to when I was sort of thinking about where food sits in the centre of some other big issues. So the UK has been actually very influential over thinking. The UK, I think, is head of the game in terms of its thinking, in terms of its investment. Unfortunately, Europe, I think, is not yet there, and I think those of you that deal with things in Europe will realise that the UK, along with Sweden and possibly, one or two other countries, are realising that Europe has to change and has to think much harder about primary production systems than it has in the past. But at the moment, there are a lot of people in Europe that I think have, in a sense, got their head in the sand over Europe is missing an opportunity, I suppose you might say. As far as primary production is concerned, what followed on from Foresight was this report, Feeding the Future. Don't want to go through this in detail, but this was purposefully put together by, you see the logos on the bottom there, the industry, primary producers or representatives of primary producers, with very little science. I think I was probably the only scientist in the strict sense who participated in this, actually for the industry to actually state what it felt were the priorities looking ahead to 2030 in terms of where the industry was looking for, primary producers were looking for innovation, the innovations that they were looking for. Very important in the context of the ATP, because of course these are the areas which also require skills, training, etc. So important messages came out of that report. And then, of course, as Peter just alluded to, the July of last year, government actually put together as one of its industrial strategies, it's got industrial strategies for a raft of things, all those things that I listed earlier on have got their own strategy, put forward their strategy for agricultural technologies. And it's interesting to see that, you know, I mean, there's a political narrative in here to the extent that it would say, you know, the UK is very good in certain places, which it is. You know, we've got a strong bioscience base. We've got some exceptionally good agricultural production businesses. We've got fantastic retail companies, and we've also got a lot of very good food manufacturers. So we're in a very strong place. But actually, we don't see this as a single industry. We see it as, in some senses, quite often there's a certain amount of friction up and down those supply chains. But if we could see this as an integrated whole and play with the strengths, what government is saying, we want you to think of this as a single sector and to actually think of it like the car manufacturing sector. It might have lots of components, but ultimately what you sell is a car. Here what we're talking about is a range of different sectors, which probably, as a certain amount of adversarial interaction. Let's think of it as in an integrated way, and let's invest in it because it's important for the future. And so these are some of the things that, this again, a bit of PR from government talking about some East Malling research there on water use, making the point that food manufacturing is our largest manufacturing sector in the country, something about LED lighting and various other things which they're sort of just to get people thinking about how technology plays out in food. And again, those are some of the figures that government would now promulgate. The fact that actually agriculture employs getting on for 500,000 people, that there's a lot of exportation associated with food and drink. That the farming industry contributes 9 billion. If we didn't have that 9 billion of productivity, the food industry would likely be on the same trajectory as the pharmaceutical industry in terms of thinking of other places in the world where it would be able to manufacture more cheaply. But the provenance of UK food is very important. And of course, the role of agricultural technologies in international development as well is a significant component. One of the sort of downsides, which is sort of sits within the Agri-Tech strategy, is the fact that we spend, you know, and we have continued to spend even through this flatlining period that I talked about previously, somewhere in the region of £450 million of government money goes into something which is badged as agricultural research. The issue is, though, that it's spread across a whole range of different parts of government and government agencies, all with their own strategy and all with their own sort of priorities. So actually that figure, if you look at that with other OECD comparators, and this comes out of sort of Treasury and DEFRA analysis, this is very close to the top of spend in OECD countries. So it's not we're not spending all that money. We are spending a lot of money. The question is, why is it then that when you look at a graph like that, which is total factor productivity, and where our performance is the brown line, other countries that previously were not performing as well as we were back in the 70s have gone past us, are on an upward trajectory, and only Ireland continues to be as poorly performing as us in terms of total factor productivity. Now, total factor productivity, as economists in the audience know more about how these things are calculated than I do, but essentially it's a measure of the added value that you get from knowledge, research, things which are other than the labour you put in or the raw materials that you put in. In other words, the added value from, you might say, increasing productivity on the back of those sort of, you might say, non-resource related issues. So there's something going wrong between the investment that government is making and the outcomes of that investment at farm and food production level. And that comes back to the whole thing that I started with, which is that's almost certainly something to do with not the research, but it's something to do with the exchange of knowledge, the translation of that research, and the skills and the expertise in order to receive that information and put it into practice. And that's a lot of the emphasis of the Agri-Tech strategy. So I'm not going to go through this in detail because you've probably seen this. So there were a whole range of different actions here. And I'm just going to flag these actions, not in detail, but just to show you where this triangle of research and knowledge exchange and skills comes into play. So, for example, the first one is all about what are we spending the money on and where is the money going? What is the research spend that we have? The next one's all about skills. The third one actually teaches, well, it says really all about innovation. This is the investment in the Catalyst Fund. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Then others, some to do with innovation, and another one which has a high priority in regard to research. Some of the other actions, this one, for example, is to do with the Agri-Skills Forum, a lot of communication issues. So again, that's very much to do with knowledge exchange and skills. And so we go through. So the whole of the Agri-Tech strategy is really trying to put into place actions that will make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So it's not just good enough to win gold medals in a science Olympics. It's not good enough just simply to have, some communication, some messaging which is selling, let's say, unique selling points for, say, a communication part of the industry, and let's say marketing side. It's really important that these things are coherently put together, and the skills side is really important. Both the skills in terms of the way in which things are translated, but also how they're implemented. So, for example, just picking up the Catalyst Fund, the Catalyst Fund has really been, I think, a great success. I mean, this has been, several tens of millions put into play. I think we're on our third round now. Extraordinarily well supported. I mean, it's brought into play companies that have never really featured in terms of investment in research and innovation, brought them into play. This is just an example, again, some of the sort of publicity documents, talking about some of the projects. One here about looking at lambs, using imaging systems on pregnant ewes in order to actually be able to determine more efficiently the way in which the breeding process is going forward, less waste, more yield from that perspective. There's something over here about disease in terms of storage disease in potatoes. There's a project here which is to do with shelf life of tomatoes, and these little graphics here just indicate the number of companies that are actually involved in some of these projects. So the Catalyst Fund is really, I think, drawing industry, particularly SMEs, but some large companies, drawing industry closer to the research community. But it's very much project by project. So in a sense, you could argue it's not very strategic, it's very market driven, it's not actually necessarily building capacity in a strategic sense. What I think is important, and this is sort of, you might say, beginning to think more strategically, is that we have to recognise that actually it's the supply chains which are really important drivers. And in the agri-food area, I think this is, in a sense, me talking now, that actually the central part of primary production, I mean, there's a lot of supply and demand, even within that primary production, where you might say livestock producers, very dependent upon feed from arable producers or straw. There's a lot of toing and froing in terms of within the primary production sector. But in many ways, you could say the demand that is placed on primary producers by people further down the chain in terms of processors, retailers, does provide demand back on those businesses which are actually providing products, whether we're talking about seeds or fertilizers or advice, buildings design, embryos, the whole raft of products which are actually provided to primary producers. So there are messages being conveyed up and down in terms of what is being demanded and, of course, in terms of supply. And these are very strong drivers, which I think from a research perspective we have to be much more alert to. The research community has probably been a little bit in a bubble, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, not needing too much to think about what these drivers are. And I think now we have to be much more alert to the way in which these supply chains are, to some extent, determining ultimately how markets perform, and actually ultimately how you might say how the economy benefits from the innovation which we hope comes about. Thinking now about I produced this slide for a different purpose, but we have got a range of funders. We've got funders who fund training, education, higher education funding council, and a variety of other people. We have people who fund research. Often they're the same people, but they often are funding down different strands, different mechanisms which go into the training budgets as compared to research budgets. That funding travels into applied research providers, such as here at Harper and other places, as well as training. Again, often the same people, a lot of interaction, certainly the same organisation. In the final analysis, we depend a lot on what I've called their knowledge exchange agents, who need new skills because they can't receive these messages, the new knowledge, without the new skills in order to assemble that knowledge into a way that they can then convey it into end user businesses and the increased competitiveness. So I think it's important, I know these are just sort of graphical representations, but I think we all have to think harder about how these different pieces of the jigsaw are put together, speak to one another, and are coherent. And I think the ATP, for me, it has been, looking in from the outside, not being heavily involved with it, the ATPs, particularly the ATP we're talking about tonight, has been very good at beginning this process. And I think we're at the start of it, but I think it's going in absolutely the right direction. I said I would say something about land and land use, because I think land and land use and the whole, said the primary production is at the centre of this. Actually, what's at the centre of it is the way we use our natural resources, of which land is probably the most important thing. And I could talk about every one of those pictures. All of those are pictures of something in the UK, whether it's a semi-natural habitat. It's all managed land. We don't have any land in the UK that is not managed. And you can talk about the economics of that, whether it's forestry or food production, or whether it's tourism. You can talk about the social dimension, and you can talk about the environmental dimension of that. And it's really important to get those pictures in place, and it all has value, and we have to think about it in a coherent way. I'd like to challenge people with these pictures. Some of you have seen them before. By coincidence, there are 16 combines in that picture in Brazil, harvesting maize in Brazil. This happens to be a wheat field. The Bruegel painting from the 16th century. It happened to be 16 individuals harvesting that field of wheat. And you've got to ask the question, which of these systems is really more sustainable? I mean, here we had, traction from wind, possibly a little bit of water traction, and it was basically human and animal traction, no fossil fuel use. Probably nothing was wasted because they went into thatching as well as into bread making. But of course the population was starving for a significant part of the time, and all sorts of other things as well. So the view that I would take is that actually if we didn't have that, if we didn't have intensive agriculture, we certainly wouldn't have that. So essentially it is fundamental to looking after, let's say, natural ecosystems and thinking about the conservation of some of the other ecosystem services apart from food production, that we do our food production extremely efficiently. And it's important to think that we are actually managing an ecosystem. So, there are all sorts of outcomes that we require from land. We want to increase food production, we want to conserve biodiversity, we want to have livelihoods, we want to reduce greenhouse gases, we need clean water. All those things are things that we want. Nobody's going to argue that we shouldn't be having them. And there are things that we have at our disposal to manage the soil, the water, the genetic variation, the skills that we've got in terms of agronomy and such like. And there are various uses that we can put land to, you see there. And actually, if you only had to deal with a couple of those things at any one time, as you know, you can solve a simultaneous equation with two variables in it. We all did that at school. But when you've got 3 or 4 variables, you can't really do it. So you need a model, or at least you need some concepts where you can actually think about the way in which you integrate these things. And actually, at the end of the day, there are no win-wins. It's all trade-offs. And it's all about how you quantify the trade-offs in any particular set of circumstances. So I have a hypothesis, which actually I shall reveal in a moment, but this is really where the concept of sustainable intensification, which was sort of born in the Royal Society report, Reaping the Benefits, it wasn't actually born there, but it was adopted really from some work in Africa as a phrase, really all about simultaneously increasing productivity, increasing resource use efficiency, but reducing some of the negative effects. An integrating concept along the lines I've just been talking about, but something which is basically driven by outcomes, not the means, so there's no sort of prejudice about how this will be done. It's based on data, and it's an inclusive concept, and it's something which would include anything. In other words, it's a both and rather than an either or concept. So I have a hypothesis which I look hard for data to disprove, as a good scientist should. And my hypothesis is that if you produce as efficiently as possible on the smallest footprint of land, which is capable of delivering and not over-delivering the market requirements, or if you're a subsistence farmer, the requirements of your dependents, then that actually is the greenest and usually the most profitable way to farm. And I look for data which actually, you might say, confounds that hypothesis. And I think that the UK, coming back to us, the UK is a really good place to do this work and to actually really examine in detail how to use land in the most appropriate way. If you look at our geodiversity, the geological map of Britain, there aren't many countries that are on such small area that would give you that amount of diversity. And that, of course, is translated into a hugely diverse way of using land. I mean, obviously, you can see the sort of the grouse moors of Scotland and the arable lands of the east and the grasslands of the west. But within that, there's a huge diversity of businesses managing land for different purposes. And if you actually put on top of that the fact that we are in a part of the world, without going through this in detail, where actually plant productivity, which is at the end of the day the driver for livestock production and much else as well, is actually less constrained and becoming less constrained because of the elevation in temperature and the elevation of carbon dioxide. So we're in a very good part of the world to actually start to think hard about how we deliver sustainable intensification. This is some really useful data from a paper in Nature a while ago, where there was an analysis made of 174 crops, where the larger the blob, the more we produce in area terms and also in volume terms. If you go along anything to this side of the line, in the period between, I think this is a 10-year period, between a 20-year period between 85 and 2005, anything over here is we're producing more. And anything here we're producing less. So here you've got wheat, rice, maize, soya, rapeseed. If you go over here, that's saying we're producing more just simply by ploughing more land. More land going under the plough to produce more. If you go up here, it means we're actually producing more by being more efficient. And of course, good to see we've got the major crops, broadly speaking. This is where we need to be. And so that's an important driver. You could do analyses of this sort. This is yield, but you could do analyses in a whole variety of different ways. You could look at greenhouse gas emissions. You could look at livestock production. So it's quite an interesting graphic. And I think what it tells us, or one of the messages, is we have to be smarter about what we measure. and we have to think harder about the metrics that we use in our production systems. It's not good enough, although it's important to think about tons per hectare or litres of milk per cow, or those sort of things are still important. We have to think what we're really producing. Are we producing a nutrient, kilograms of protein, or are we producing edible energy rather than just kilograms of grain? And is it per hectare, or is it per cubic metre of water, or is it per kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent? Actually, it's all of them, and therefore, in some circumstances, we're managing, we're trying to realise the potential of the genotype by managing the environment, but we have to think about the environmental consequences as well. So metrics are going to become extremely important in this context. And that, of course, is Action 6 on Agri-Tech, the Centre for Agricultural Informatics and Metrics for Sustainability. Another driver from Agri-Tech. We produce huge amounts of data in the food system. Much of it is used particularly in the retail sector. Much of it just disappears. You think about farmers who collect all sorts of soil and weather data and yield data, stick it in a file, maybe look at it every so often, and then after 10 years think they don't need it anymore. Just think about that reservoir of knowledge which could be used to derive some greater value. And I'm just going to give you one example which I like. This is a crop example. So if you grow wheat and you grow it well, you can produce without too much problem 10 tonnes per hectare. If you get disease such as septoria, you can halve that yield without any problem. And so effectively, if you think about what the greenhouse gas emissions are to grow a crop of wheat, it takes somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare to grow a 10-ton crop of wheat. That includes all the nitrogen, etc., etc. So any waste is actually a loss not just of the crop, but also its inappropriate land use because you've not got the most out of land, but also the emissions per tonne of grain, of course, are much greater. So if you analyse this in detail, as a group in ADAS very nicely did, and of course the majority of the greenhouse gases are embedded in the nitrogen fertiliser, it shows you, without going into the detail of this, actually that if you choose not to use a fungicide and yet you're still applying nitrogen, then actually your greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of wheat are almost double, not quite double, if you had used your nitrogen in an optimum way and actually had controlled the disease. So this gives the lie, in a sense, to the notion that actually, somehow some sort of rural idyll of no fertilizer and no fungicide is actually going to be good for the planet. But what it also sends is a message about that complexity. So it comes back to my triangle. This is a piece of research. To do this research requires collecting a lot of data and analysing a lot of data. There's a complexity in this message which actually requires translating to those people that are ultimately going to be putting it into practice and actually saying, well, actually I should get the timing of my nitrogen right, or I should be using the right amount of chemical to actually control this particular disease. So that message has got to be translated, and then it's got to be put into practice, and somebody's actually got to be able to do that in a practical way. So I think it captures this triangle of research, knowledge exchange, and actually then the training and the skills required. I think with that final message I shall conclude. Thank you.